What you said at the outset was interesting about, well, let's not forget how we became a country.
Right.
We were embroiled in a war. Okay, that's true. It starts off really messy. But I want to think, and we'll talk about this hopefully throughout, but when the founding fathers came up with the right to free speech and assembly, I'm not sure they were thinking about war. They were thinking about, these were they were men, yes, but they were enlightened men of the Enlightenment, of the European Enlightenment. They'd read a lot
Yes.
of books about natural rights. And I think they envisioned, uh, and that's why the words peaceful assembly is in the First Amendment.
Right.
When they said free speech, they envisioned a marketplace of ideas,
Yes, they
right?
did.
They envisioned soapboxes, literally, right?
Yes.
That you stood on a soapbox in a public square and you had something interesting to say, and someone
Hmm.
stood on another soapbox and he had or she had something to say, and you went, oh, okay, this is what representative democracy looks like. I get to
Right.
see this, and the government will hear what I think, and it'll make the government will make better decisions because I'm more informed and I'm reading newspapers because there's a freedom of the press. I just think when I said Charlottesville, January 6th, BLM, Black Lives Matter, pro Hamas rallies, anti, the words First Amendment and free speech are thrown around a lot, very
They are.
liberally. And yet, what I meant to say, and I probably didn't say it artfully enough, was to say, but it doesn't seem to me necessarily, it looks like we need a national civics lesson. That in fact, that's what is meant by free speech.
Well,
Does that mean? Because in fact, we are a more permissive country when it comes to free speech compared to other
absolutely.
Western democracies. But do we mean this? Do we mean storming the Capitol? Do we mean calling for the death of people? Do we mean, getting on social media and threatening ICE agents with murder or death in retaliation for their acts? That's the question about, well, don't I have a free speech right to that? And that's
Right.
really confusing, I think, for people.
Okay, so there is so much I could respond to that. So give me the hook if I go on too long, but I have like four different things that makes me want to talk about. I think the first is I'm a free speech advocate and I'm trained as a First Amendment litigator. It may not surprise you for me to say I'm comfortable saying the answer to your question is mostly a yes. I don't think it includes storming the Capitol, but I do think free speech. I agree with you that the framers were animated by the idea of free speech in service of democracy, political speech, right? Being able to actually have a civic discourse that related to our governance of our fledgling democracy,
And
right?
not spitting. I
Sure,
mean,
right. And
not
like I'm not
spitting
talking
to say
about conduct. I'm not talking
right,
about
right. I know what, and
spitting
we're going to
or
talk about
kicking or
conduct too.
going in.
Right.
I'm just talking about the temperature of that rhetoric,
Yeah.
saying I wish someone would die or you're a member of the Gestapo, right? Actually like saying
Yeah.
things that are so heated.
Yeah.
And there are of course different countries set the slider in different places. For example, the UK right now has a massive crackdown on what they consider hateful speech, where people are actually getting charges for saying, for example, saying things that might be considered fully protected
Well,
anti-trans
it's
rhetoric
also
here.
important for the audience to know the
Yeah,
United States does not have hate speech laws.
we do
When
not.
when people say that, you should always stop them at dinner and go, no, 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 no. I watched the FOLCS event. They do
Yep,
in Europe, but in the
they
United
do.
States, there are no hate speech laws.
And there are really two phrases as a First Amendment attorney that you are immediately your flags go up. One is hate speech, and you're like, well, we should talk about this. And the other is fire in a crowded theater, which maybe we'll get to in a minute when we talk about
Yeah.
incitement. So the first, I think your historical read is correct, right? The courts, I mean, the framers absolutely intended the First Amendment, I think, as a political document. And there is something so beautiful about the First Amendment.
Yeah.
There's a scholar named Bert Newborn,
Yeah.
and he has described this. He has a book called Madison's Music, and he describes the First Amendment as really an expanded philosophical poem about how democracy works. So, our First Amendment isn't just freedom of speech, right? It's freedom of religion, right? First, what you think. Freedom of speech, what you say to people, freedom of the press, which is, oh, I have this idea, I've said it, now we're going to publicize it, freedom of peaceable assembly, right? Everybody hears about it and you get together. And then finally, your right to petition your government for redress of grievances. That literally tells a story of political democracy. I have thoughts, I share them with people. We print it in the press, people hear about it, we assemble, and then we go to our
So
government and we
what
fight
you're
for a new
saying,
regime.
what you're saying is that the aspirations of the founding fathers were more elegant. They saw
Yes.
they saw an elegance to the First Amendment that, and that's why and maybe when you're answering this question, I'm going to load you up a little more because I want to say, if you took a walk, if Lee Rowland today took a walk with Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and they would be shocked that they could fly to Minneapolis. They'd be shocked that Minneapolis was a city or a state, frankly, and said, let's walk around and let's see what's going on. What would they say? Would they say, oh my God, this is exactly what we had in mind? Or what the hell is going on in your country?
That's an interesting comment. I would say there are a couple ways to answer that, but my initial thought is not that they would be appalled at the sharpness of the speech. They would be appalled by a massed paramilitary force engaging with nonviolent protesters with federal power. I can tell you that is about the most unconstitutional, unframer conception that could exist. So again, and I want to make sure I'm following up because I don't want to be on record too long as saying, yes, the genteel First Amendment that required us, right, to be, cautious with our words and thoughtful and political. Sure, that was their intent. But we have a First Amendment, and the way that our laws work is a common law system. And what that means for folks who don't know the law, and this has existed since before America was an idea, is that somebody gets harmed, you slip and fall, or your constitutional rights are violated, and you go to court. And judges look at what happened, and they can't prevent harm. They're just looking at something that happened, and they're saying, okay, that was lawful or it wasn't, right? So in terms of constitutional rights, I get arrested by the police for calling one of them a goddamn fascist, right? And I'm using those words specifically. This is from a First Amendment case. And the question is that something other than protected speech? And what's fascinating about the history of the First Amendment is that when the First Amendment started to be interpreted by the Supreme Court, one of their first cases was about a street preacher in Syracuse who was out passing out anti-war flyers. And that guy was sent to jail. And the Supreme Court said, that's fine, because we all know that in wartime, these words may sound familiar, that's a clear and present danger to our democracy.